Okay, class, just wanted to, kind of go with you along this novel to show you, how to analyze. And so, when you're analyzing artwork, you have a lot of things to think about. Perspective, where the point of view is from. Are you down low looking at someone up high? Colors, patterns, symbolic shapes and shading and in the art there's a whole lot of things to analyze and I'm not going to do all the analysis for you, but I'm going to give you an example with a few of these pages and also example of rhetorical analysis with a few of these pages as well. But just starting off with the artwork on this page, if we notice, we have Dahmer walking alone on the side of the road. Okay, already you have the idea of isolation, loneliness, the idea of a journey, traveling along a path. And so if you look at that, this journey that Dahmer's going on, which is a very negative one, that leads, to his imprisonment or incarceration and brutal killings of many people. This idea of a journey here, this road kind of matches his journey. It's like a struggle itself. There's up and down hills, and there's light places and gray places and dark places, but overwhelmingly dark. And that's Dahmer's journey too. He tried to fight these urges and this thing that happened in his brain. When he hits puberty, something gets crosswired in his brain where he becomes, attracted to dead things, dead men and stuff like that. That wasn't something he wanted. It happened to him, and he did struggle against it. And that's exactly what this road symbolizes with the shading in the hills. If you'll notice, there's some trees along the side of the road, but it's a lot of death as well. It seems like his house where he's walking from is away from all these houses. And, we've got a lot of dead trees and cut off trees on the side of the road. We have a lot of power poles that look like crosses, that again, put forth that idea, of death. Right? So, there's a whole lot that can be analyzed just right here. And also wanted to point out, this idea of perspective and the way that Dahmer's face is shaded black here. This black shading we see on Dahmer's face always occurs when he's experiencing a moment of darkness, when it's something about killing, right? And obviously he's found this dead cat here. And if you notice, our perspective as a reader is from down at his feet looking up at him as if, we're victims, that he's powerful, has power over us. This darkness is something that's going to be, it's just going to keep showing up every time he's thinking about killing. So if you look at the bottom of page 23 here, when he's early on and he's dissolving animal carcasses in acid he gets from his father, who was a chemist for a chemical weapons plant, as was author Derf Backderf's father. You'll notice that he has that darkness on his face, and almost like a light source, but opposite with darkness. His darkness spreads to the other teenagers around him, and that's exactly what the darkness of Dahmer did. For every person he kills, some of that darkness inside him spreads pain and misery and loss to all the people involved in those victims' lives. And that's what we see here symbolically in the art. So on this next page, just a little bit more of the art analysis, and then we'll, probably won't talk about that as much. You can see, this long shadow of Dahmer, and he's faced with, two paths in the woods, and both of them lead to darkness. Now, later, author Derf Backderf will say that, if some parents would have noticed, Dahmer wouldn't have had a great life. It would have been dark. He probably would have been doped up on, antipsychotic meds his whole life, living in his dad's basement. And that's one of these dark paths. And then the other dark path is, where he went. He ended up being a serial killer. So we have that kind of metaphor here. Now, as we're starting to analyze rhetoric, of course, rhetoric is the use of words. So, the neat thing about comics is they often bolden words that are supposed to stand out to you. But one of the ideas of rhetoric is audience. And as Derf Backderf is writing this, and his real name's John Backderf, so if you hear me call him John Backderf, that's Derf Backderf is his writing name because he thinks it's a funny name. But he is thinking about you, the audience, as a reader. and how to get this content to you in the best way possible so that you feel the emotions that he's trying to convey. And one of the best ways that writers do this is through diction, through word choice, which can build images and symbolism and metaphors. Um, and speaking of audience, like in the rhetorical analysis assignment sheet lecture, and like in the Bush letter lecture, there are, 3 degrees of audience: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And primary audience is who Durf Backdurf wrote this for. And he wrote this for people interested in reading about serial killers. And there's a big interest in that because it's a really strange thing in our species, and only in our species, with few exceptions. Um, so that's his primary audience: people who like comic books and people who read, about serial killers. Now, secondary audience is an audience that you didn't necessarily intend. And this is a big group. I mean, this is everybody who didn't, it's an audience that you don't intend to be a reader, but it's one that is going to be a reader anyway. So you as an author, also, you write primarily for your primary audience, but you also take into account your secondary audience, people who are going to end up reading this that's not quite your target audience. And so, I think he really wrote this book for people interested in serial killers, and and then his secondary audience were, people who read comic books, people who read, journalism, people who read those kind of materials, but, might not necessarily go out and buy this book, but, end up coming across it anyway. Now, the tertiary audience is an audience he never expected to read this, and I think it really got a lot more famous than he think. I don't think that he realized that like 8 professors at Gordon would be teaching this, and their students will be that tertiary audience, but here we are. So when he's using diction here and this imagery, it's supposed to have an effect on you. For instance, when he says the kids were stirred together in a hormonal soup, right? And that Dahmer was a nobody, one of these shy kids who turned into social invalids. Invalids are people who can't do anything. They're incapable of doing something. So he's socially invalid. And then you have, blast of adolescent hit, meekly accepted their fate, became invisible. People had contempt for him. Those types of word choices and imagery that he's, using there is supposed to really kind of make you feel the difficulty that Dahmer's experiencing. And you see it again here at the top of the page, 33. Again, Dahmer's isolated by himself. He's the only one that's leaving the panel. That's these square shapes are called panels in comics and graphic novels. He's the only one outside of it. Again, isolated. But look at the language used to describe this high school: a teeming anthill. Student population surged, exceeding building's capacity, packed classrooms, gridlocked halls, cafeteria stuffed wall to wall, shock to the system. If you were shy or slow to make friends, you were trampled. For most kids, an opportunity to make new friends by the bushel. Some of the author's friends will be lifelong pals. But Dahmer didn't make friends. As far as I can tell, he had none. He was the loneliest kid he'd ever met. So, all these kind of this imagery is supposed to paint the picture. And if you're not aware exactly what I'm talking about, the baby boomers, the big population that occurred after World War II during the late 70s, these are their children. So there's a huge population boom that exceeded what the country could handle. So all public schools were just a nightmare. All right. Okay. So again, you start to see a little aspect of rhetoric being used here where, setting is being applied to the emotional state of the author. The author is connecting ideas of the city dying to, Dahmer's mental health dying. Also, there's going to be some comparisons that are starting to be made where the author is comparing himself to Dahmer and how much they're alike. And the whole idea of that is what you call juxtaposition, which is also one of the minor rhetorical techniques. That's when you compare two things in order to, especially two things that are very different, in order to highlight a point that he's making. And he, compares himself and Dahmer and how much they're alike, and then again, also how much the parents are different, how much their home life is different, to all bring about his purpose. The idea that had, parents and adults, acted differently, Dahmer wouldn't have become what he became. And so you're going to see as you read, I know I don't have it a lot on this lecture, but you're going to see as you read a lot of comparison between his home and then Bagdorf's home, then him and Bagdorf, back and forth, like 100 times. And that's, again, a rhetorical device. Okay. So you also will start to see these comparisons here. And I want to talk about this part at the top. John Bagdorf, or Derf Bagdorf, says that, that Dahmer had a brother that was several years younger. But the author says in the narration, Dave isn't part of this story. He's just a kid and beneath my notice. He certainly had a big role in Jeff's life, but I didn't witness it. And what I want to point out about that is that establishes author credibility, even though that's not like really research. One, it shows that the author is considering Dahmer's little brother and not dragging him into the story, because obviously, growing up as Dahmer's little brother was probably, not easy, especially after, Dahmer gets busted and commits all, for committing all these murders. But also the author's being honest about what he knows and what he doesn't know. And he's like, hey, man, I don't know anything about Dahmer's relationship with his little brother, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to make it up. I'm not going to talk about it. And see, that establishes author credibility. So if you're writing that essay, that might be a good point. Now, again, we're going to start to see juxtaposition. For you guys who are not aware, during the 1970s, prior to the 1970s, women were not exactly encouraged to be a part of the workforce, and in fact, quite the opposite. And many of the jobs that women were allowed to have purposefully paid way less than men's job. And the idea was that if you make women financially dependent on men, they're more likely to get married and be moms and stay at home, barefoot and pregnant, that type of thing. And many of the women in the 70s, they just, they weren't happy about that anymore. They didn't want to be stay-at-home moms. And Dahmer's mom had a lot of mental issues. You can see by the diction, the audience choice, the audience rhetoric here, choosing certain words, chafing in the role of the housewife, heavy baggage, odd, moody, fragile, damaged moms, that type of stuff. And if you'll notice on the panel to the left of that on 40, he compares his dad to Lionel Dahmer as well. Not very good with teenage sons, never saw much of them, that type of thing. Even the Dahmer house is symbolic to Dahmer itself. You can only see the front side of it from the road, just like you see the facade of what looks like a healthy individual and a healthy family, and it's in the woods, and generally in literature, being in the wilderness is all about losing one's soul. That's when you're in danger of losing your soul. Anyways, and again, we have comparisons between normality of everybody else and then what goes on with Dahmer, and that's going to be a constant thing. Anyways, okay. Notice again, Dahmer's in the forefront. Okay. Fig is also a character that's going to be used to be compared to Dahmer. Okay, as he's the kind of person with obvious mental issues, whereas Dahmer's the person who kind of slides under the radar. All right. Again, going into author credibility on the top of 51, we talk about, the author talks about their relationship. He's very honest about it. He's saying, look, we weren't making fun of him. We were on the bottom end of the social ladder with Dahmer. It's just like he was one of the gang. And, in fact, a lot of students, for some reason, when they read this, they think that these guys, these Dahmer guys, were mean to Dahmer. And a lot of the critics that saw the movie and read this comic blamed, them on Dahmer's downfall, and that's kind of how it was portrayed. And I just think those people were stupid. They didn't, not the students, but the critics were kind of dumb and didn't read this really the right way. But a lot of students feel like, maybe they're kind of mean to Dahmer, a little bit. But what I want you to understand, is if you get that kind of that misinterpretation, is that Dahmer valued these friends. He was in on these jokes that they made fun of each other, and Dahmer was kind of like the star of their group. You know what I mean? And Dahmer even said that this was the best time of his life. Like he was happy, and his life ended when he left high school, and that they were the best friends that he ever had in the capacity that he had to have friends. But we start to get, again, that technique of juxtaposition, him thinking about the audience here, where, we see for the first time, a female that has curves in this comic, and, it's her butt. And it's this guy, liking what he sees. And then we get the comparison to Dahmer, and Dahmer liking what he sees. And so I don't know, you guys might not know, but being, gay during this time was a lot harder. I mean, it wasn't, uncommon for anybody being gay to be, killed and crucified in the middle of North Dakota on a freezing night on a chain link fence, or, being drugged by, a pickup truck. So again, this idea of Dahmer being gay at this time period is, kind of gives you the idea of how isolated he was. But then when I talk about how his fantasy, what he liked and was attracted to sexually was dead men, corpses, that really brings about that comparison even more. And he uses diction, word choice to get that across. Spawned, perverse sexual hunger, fetid part of his psyche gurgled up this miscreant desire, voracious, immediately devoured him whole. These types of word choices really put across how this was kind of a monstrous demon that Dahmer was resisting. Okay, and speaking of author credibility, we have actual artwork from newspapers and yearbooks and the author that occurred, during high school, and that adds to author credibility. Okay, again, we have more diction here. Rested back, controlled, dark urges, churned. You have that vision of Dahmer again, above you, looking down with the darkness. Again, we have, this part here where he tells you that each one of his friends got creeped out by Dahmer in this instinctual, watch out for him, want to survive kind of way. We start to get a little bit of that as well, and a little bit of comparison to his own life. And then you have, this visual image of how Dahmer's life was very different. Now, this is something you're going to see reoccur about 4 or 5 times in the comic, and it has to do with purpose. And this is the real purpose. Where were all the damn adults? Why weren't the parents there? Why weren't the parents more attentive? Why didn't the guidance counselor notice? Why didn't the teachers notice? Why. And he says at the top, he's like, look, I've often asked why I never spoke. Often people ask me why I never spoke up, why I didn't get Dahmer help. And he's like, you got to remember, this is like 1976. You didn't narc on people. I'm sure you students know the rhyme. Snitches get stitches and wind up dead in ditches. Right? And but he also points out, look, man, I was a teenager. I'm not trained in psychology to be able to help people out. The better question is, where were the damn adults? And that's a quote that you're going to see several times in this book that all points to the author's purpose. Could this have been prevented if adults gave 2 poops? And I think that's one of his goals for this novel, is to make us as readers realize that when you're a parent, you better care, or you might end up with a nightmare on your hands.